Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Now, on this channel, we've looked at a lot of the cultural and archaeological background of the Bible. The Bible is a product of its own time and place. It didn't drop out of the sky or pop out of a vacuum. Now, that's why we think there is so much value in looking at the cultural context of the Bible. So today we're starting a short series where we'll look at what's called the mythic context of the Bible. We'll explore how the Bible adopts and adapts particular mythic traditions from the ancient Near East, the world in which the Bible was written. Now, a lot of the stories in the Bible demonstrate similarities to other ancient stories, but the Bible also utilizes these frameworks in unique ways that make the biblical stories distinct from those of other ancient peoples. In today's video, we're looking at what scholars call the sea myth or the combat myth. Now, this is a massive topic. Scholars have been writing about it for more than a century. And we aren't going to cover it all here. Today, we're just going to talk about the ideas of myth and the Bible through the lens of the sea myth, what it is and where it comes from. In the next two videos, we'll look at a specific example of it and then where we see it in the Bible. Well, yes and no, but mostly yes. It really depends on what we mean when we use the word myth. Now, there are a couple kinds of arguments you can make in regards to the Bible and myth, so let's be really clear about what we are and what we aren't saying. Now, most people tend to use the word myth as a synonym for false, something opposed to true. Now, if you were to argue that the Bible is myth in that sense, well, I'd have to disagree. I would say the Bible is true and trustworthy, even if I don't think all of its events are historical in a way that modern readers understand it. But we'll get to that distinction later. I just want to ask you to stick with us as we explore those distinctions. Now, some people would say the Bible is a myth as a way to say it isn't true, but that's not how we mean myth, and that's not how people who study myth use the word. Now, that's because when we use the word myth, we don't mean something that is necessarily fanciful or fictional. A better understanding of this technical sense of myth is a symbolic account of reality cast in narrative form. A myth is a story about gods, divine figures, and people that tells us something that is true about the real order of the world. So in that sense, yes, the Bible is myth, or maybe a better word to use is mythic. This word has particular literary qualities that are similar to the genre that scholars call myth. And in that sense, we don't see any problem with saying that the Bible is mythic as well. What we're diving into today is how the Bible adapts, modifies, and incorporates the myths of its neighbors. Specifically, we're looking at the sea myth, although others call it the combat myth or Chaoskampf.
Chaoskampf is a German compound word that translates to chaos struggle or struggle with chaos. The concept of Chaoskampf in biblical studies is most closely associated with the work of Hermann Gunkel, although the idea itself predates his work. Gunkel is an important scholar of the Bible who lived and wrote in the early 20th century. When people talk about Chaoskampf, it's largely because of his work. Gunkel's book on this subject is titled in English, Creation and Chaos in the Primeval Era and the Eschaton. This book is really what cemented the idea of Chaoskampf into biblical studies. So what is Chaoskampf? The core idea is that multiple mythic or religious traditions involve some kind of conflict or struggle between an ordering, creator, deity, and the forces of chaos. In the ancient Near East, the two most cited examples are the Enuma Elish, which is a Babylonian myth, and the Baal cycle as it was preserved at Ugarit. These are also the most relevant examples for comparing with the Bible, and Gunkel's work, not just with Chaoskampf, but particularly with the Psalms, has been immensely influential. Since Gunkel's time, the study of Chaoskampf has evolved and been refined by subsequent scholars. In contemporary scholarship, the term Chaoskampf isn't used as much, having been replaced with terms like the sea myth or combat myth. Since the early 1900s, there's been a lot of good work on this subject. And one influential work that has shaped my thinking is John Day's book, God's Conflict with the Dragon in the Sea, published in 1985. In this work, Day correctly identifies that the biblical material has a stronger correlation with Canaanite iterations of the myth than with Babylonian traditions. And in other words, the biblical ideas of the sea myth are more in common with the Baal cycle than with the Enuma Elish. And we'll see why that's important in a future video, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Another important collection of essays was published under the title Creation and Chaos, a reconsideration of Hermann Gunkel's Chaoskampf hypothesis. Quite a mouthful. These essays were published in 2013 and cover a lot of fairly niche subjects, but they are really interesting contributions. Most recently, Paul Cho's book, Myth, History, and Metaphor in the Hebrew Bible, which was published in 2019, is another significant and helpful contribution to the study of the sea myth and its salience for biblical studies. Well, Paul Cho has a very good summation of the sea myth, and we'll follow what he says for the moment. When we see the sea myth in ancient Near Eastern literature, the flow of the story moves from a state of chaos, or more accurately something like pre-order, through some kind of conflict, which leads to a state of order. The cast of characters may change, the details of the narrative may differ, but this pattern of pre-order, conflict, and order remains the same. The chaos or pre-order is usually some personification of water or a mythical being associated with the sea. This forces combat with the order in God, and this is why it has come to be called the sea myth or the combat myth, because combat or conflict with the sea, or a representation of it, is a common, even essential element of the myth. Following this conflict, there are three positive outcomes for the main deity that brings order in the narrative. The first is creation of some kind. Notably, this is creation through the ordering of chaos, not creation out of nothing or creatio ex nihilo, the way we often think of it. Next is the construction of a palace, or what we may see as a temple, usually to commemorate their defeat over forces of chaos. And finally, the deity is enthroned over the other gods because of their victory. The classic example of the sea myth is the Babylonian story called the Enuma Elish. Now, we won't go over the whole story here, but it may be helpful to see how the core sea myth got some narrative flesh on its bones. In the Enuma Elish, the story begins with the primeval gods Apsu and Tiamat, the gods of the primeval waters. These two gods commingle and make a generation of gods. This younger generation is boisterous and noisy, as young people often are, so Apsu seeks to destroy them. Before Apsu can enact his plan, the young god Ea defeats him and establishes a home for the younger gods. In this new home, the young god Marduk is born. Marduk came to be the patron deity of the city of Babylon, so there's an obvious political element to the Enuma Elish, but we'll save that for a later time. Now, Marduk was a boisterous youth, and as he was playing with the winds, he disturbed the sea goddess Tiamat. In response, Tiamat and the older generation of gods again seek to destroy the younger gods. Tiamat gives birth to all kinds of demons and monsters to fight against the young gods, who are also her offspring. This inversion of the most natural and important of ordering principles of a mother's love and care for her children is why Tiamat is associated with chaos. But the younger gods won't go down without a fight. Ea, the one who originally defeated Apsu, first comes, but he turns away from the conflict, as does Anu, another important deity. Needing a champion to fight for them, the younger gods turn to Marduk, who agrees to confront Tiamat if he is rewarded with kingship over the gods. Tiamat and Marduk battle, initially in a war of words, where Marduk cites Tiamat turning on her family as a breach of order. And this enrages Tiamat, and the two fight with weapons. Our hero is of course victorious in his combat. Following his victory, Marduk sets about ordering the world. He splits Tiamat's body in two and uses it to fashion the world. And later he makes all of humanity out of the blood of the god Kingu, the god Tiamat used to make her brood of monsters who led her forces in combat. The story climaxes with the building of a palace for Marduk, the new king of the gods. And this palace is his temple in Babylon, and when Marduk sits enthroned there, the ordering of the cosmos is complete, and the 50 names of Marduk close the story. Yeah, you might not, at least not in this exact form. We don't have an Israelite sea myth in the same way we have a Babylonian one or even a Ugaritic one. And nevertheless, the influence of the sea myth on the Bible is most definitely there. Genesis 1 and 2, for example, are strongly influenced by the sea myth. The ideas and themes of the sea myth are in the background of many passages in the Bible, just under the surface of the text, but not actually spilling onto the page. The Israelites incorporated elements of this myth into their own literature. If you don't know about the cultural world of the Bible, you won't catch how Israelite literature is playing off of the themes and ideas that were ubiquitous in their cultural world. Think of it like having a friend who drops all kinds of pop culture references. They weave song lyrics or movie quotes into their conversation without even thinking about it. It's just second nature to them. Sometimes you get the reference, sometimes you don't. But you can usually understand what they're communicating even if you don't always understand the references they're making. But to really get it, you have to know the reference. That's kind of how the Bible incorporates these other ancient Near Eastern myths. The sea myth in particular is incredibly important for understanding the Old Testament. Paul Cho goes as far as to argue that the sea myth helps to structure the worldview of the biblical writers. He says biblical writers mapped all biblical time from the creation to the eschaton in one way or another onto the plot of the sea myth. And if you're interested in understanding the Bible, you should know about the sea myth. Now, for a quick caveat, not all scholars who study this topic see eye to eye on it. While most people who study the Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern cultures recognize the ubiquity of this common myth, some take issue with how influential and apparent it is in the Bible. David Sumura, for example, is a prominent scholar who takes a more pessimistic view on Chaoskampf being significant to the biblical authors. And he rightly notes there really isn't any element of combat between the chaotic sea forces and the ordering God of the Bible, which is a key element in the sea myth when we see it outside the Bible. Other scholars have noted that the idea of chaos, as we tend to think of it, comes from the Greek world and may be something we are reading back into the Near Eastern context. This is in part why terms like sea myth and combat myth are now favored over Chaoskampf, and why pre-order is probably a better term than chaos in discussions of the sea myth. But despite these objections, we still see the sea myth as important for understanding the worldview of biblical authors and for understanding many parts of the Hebrew Bible.
So, what can we say about the connections between the Bible and the ancient Near Eastern sea myth? Now, like we said, we'll be taking a deep dive into the Baal cycle and the concepts of order and disorder over the next couple of weeks. So, for now, we'll close this video with a few things to note about how the Bible incorporates the sea myth. Now, first, let's notice something about Genesis 1 verse 2 that I think we usually miss because we're so used to reading the text a different way. Now, this verse says, "And the earth was a formless and desolate emptiness, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters." Now, as modern Christian readers, we usually imagine God creating everything from nothing, speaking the universe into existence out of thin air. But that's not the way the biblical writers pictured creation. Because they were informed by broader cultural narratives like the sea myth, they believed that in the beginning was a primordial sea, a churning, disordered water that God brought into order. The primordial sea is described as a formless and desolate emptiness covered in darkness. Now, it's not a world that we recognize, but there was a world already in existence before God brought it into order. Next, notice how God brings order to the world in Genesis 1 verses 6 and 7. Those verses say, "Then God said, 'Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters.' God made the expanse and separated the waters that were below the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so." God makes space for the dry land by separating the primordial waters into an expanse to hold them back above and below. Now, in the ancient worldview, the world basically existed in a bubble in the middle of the primordial sea. Now, this makes sense when you think about ancient people observing rain and snow coming down from the sky, and then rivers and seas being gathered around the land. Now, just like Marduk uses the pieces of Tiamat to hold back the waters in the Enuma Elish, so the Israelites believed God created an expanse to hold back the waters to form the world. The association of the sea with chaos or disorder also shows up all over the Bible. Now, this was a common association in the ancient Near East because they knew that the sea was uncontrollable. It was capable of destroying people and ships at will. The Great Flood in Genesis chapters 7 through 9 is an act of uncreation. God decides to remake the world by releasing the primordial waters to destroy it so that God can reorder the world. Jonah being thrown into the sea and swallowed by a great sea creature has similar associations. He's subjected to the uncontrollable forces of the pre-ordered world, and in a sense he's reborn or recreated when the fish spits him up onto dry land. There are lots of other examples that we could talk about, but we'll leave it at that for now. Finally, I want to point out one important way that the Genesis creation narrative is different than the sea myth, and that is the absence of combat or conflict. Now, this was an essential element in many of the creation myths of many ancient Near Eastern peoples, so its absence in Genesis is especially noteworthy. In Genesis, there's no cadre of competing gods whose battles lead to the formation of the world. Rather, the God of Genesis exists alone in the pre-ordered world, and this world obeys God's spoken command to come into order. This singular deity is without rival or equal. As one scholar has summed it up, while vehemently denouncing idolatry and unmistakably proclaiming the matchless power of the one Almighty God, biblical writers did not hesitate to draw upon these prevalent pagan images to add vividness and color to their messages, trusting that their Israelite hearers would understand the truths presented. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. Be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any future videos. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.